I feel there's a tendency to sort of treat the world wars as this kind of, a box office package of there's World War One and, America saved Europe, and then there's World War Two and then America saved the world. And yeah, there might be World War Three, but America will save the world again, sort of thing. Uh, and so I feel that kind of thinking lulls people into kind of thinking that it's going to be the same kind of war. And that
Hello, everybody. This is Pascal from Neutrality Studies, and today I'm talking again to Jeff Rich, a historian and writer publishing under his pseudonym or his channel name, The Burning Archive, on both YouTube and Substack. Jeff, great having you back.
great to be back, Pascal.
Well, you are based in Australia, and I thought we should have an update on also your assessment of world politics, what we have both learned through our channels and social media kind of journeys, because they are just as much about broadcasting as they are about learning ourselves, right?
Mm.
And
Yeah.
maybe let me start with this one. Since you began also like publishing regularly and also interviewing people regularly, what's one of the most important things that you've taken away from all the conversations?
It's interesting. I think one of the most important things is just how I feel over the last, especially over the last 6 months or so with Donald Trump and, the sort of new incarnation of America, uh, people's models of international relations, their sort of models of history are sort of starting to break a bit, and people are starting to feel for how can we reinterpret this world that we're seeing, because the sort of realistic, the realist models, the liberal models are not quite working. And so, in a way, like I did an interview with Richard Sakwa, he talked about the culture of the new Cold War. I had a conversation with Sheila Fitzpatrick, who's a historian of the Soviet Union, about the death of Stalin and, whether totalitarianism really makes sense. I had a conversation with Glenn Deason as well. And also, I've had a few conversations with Warwick Powell over the last couple of years about, particularly about the Australia dilemma, which is, uh, uh, do we are we going to be friends with China or just, you know, best buddies with the United States, and and indeed even succumb to pressure from people around, going to war with China over Taiwan. So I feel in some ways part of my biggest learning thing, and it's always been my approach to writing on the Burning Archive, writing on YouTube and on Substack, is to try to kind of make sense of this moment, which feels very much like a world crisis. But what makes it a crisis is our sort of models for making sense of the world don't make sense anymore. And so, looking for different comparisons, looking for different interpretations of historical events to sort of reframe things.
I mean, one of the infuriating things at the moment is that some of the frameworks that we thought help us to really get what's happening is like the let me call it not a nationalist lens, but the lens of the nation and
Mm.
what's good for the nation. And especially within the realist framework, you have this idea that, okay, countries, at the end of the day, they do what's best for them in certain circumstances, right? And they weigh the odds, and yeah, there are mistakes. And you have this dynamics of great power politics as well, and just how the forces work globally. But at the end of the day, the nations choose very selfishly what's good for them. Now we've seen how that framework kind of not only crumbled, but partially collapsed for
Mm.
Europe. But also, I think Australia is in a similar place where we just scratch our heads and say, like, that doesn't make any sense. These people are selecting policies that are supposed to let me put it into crude terms, but wipe the arse of the Americans much
Mm.
more than our own, right? It's like,
Yeah.
why do the Europeans and Australians and so on and others help the Americans and Washington more than they seem to be beholden to their own populations? Now, one way to explain that within the realist framework is like, okay, they're so dependent by now, they've become satellites that they don't have an independent foreign policy anymore. But we still lack, we still need to explain how that process worked and why it is. And now I've had on my channel this young colleague Nel Bonilla, and I think we talked about this before. You
Mm.
appreciated her talk as well, and she really unpacked how these elites are working, are nurtured, brought
Mm.
up, and then integrated into the U.S. Policy making circles and elites,
Yeah.
also economic elites. And I think that is something that also that chimed with you, isn't it?
Yeah, very much so. Like, I think she even used the term like cognitively colonized or something like that. That there's a difference between the mental world, if you like, of the elites of various nations and the mental world of their broad population. So you don't you, the objectives of a nation are not really defined by the broad public. It's really more defined by the key decision makers in those elites, and they operate within transnational cultural, business, and political networks, and that's the sort of thing that Nell Benila really focused on in her research and demonstrated all those kind of things. But it's so evident also in Australia that many of there's very close affiliations and scholarships and well, I've described it in other contexts as almost like grooming behaviour, like young politicians are befriended by these sort of American-based organisations. The American diplomats will sort of have, confidential conversations with various people to sort of keep tabs on the internal politics of things. There's appointments to, think tanks in America. Like, I think former Prime Minister Julia Gillard got an appointment at Brookings. Kevin Rudd went to the Asia Society, and he's now the Australian ambassador in Washington as well. So there's a very practical, kind of little world that these elites live in. And in some senses, one term people use to describe that is, empire, because there is this sort of transnational cultural influence from America, predominantly, or the Atlanticist worldview. And I think it's operating very much in Australia, even if it's a different kind of empire to what people might have imagined with like the British Empire or previous empires throughout world history. But in Australia's case, we've had a very, very long tradition of both, I guess, being like a sub-imperial power, like feeling that we're not just any old colony like India or, other non-white colonies. We were a white dominion who had were representative of what people used to describe as, the British-speaking race, and that cultural affiliation was in a way not so different to what people describe these days as the kind of liberal rules-based order. It's, parliamentary democracy, liberalism, freedom, free markets, all that sort of thing. And it created a sort of a cultural identity where people felt that they were better Britons than the original British, and that they deserved a bigger role in the empire than, the snooty aristocrats from London would give them. And often what's interpreted as sort of lackey behaviour in Australian history is actually the Australian politicians seeking to, assume that greater role within the empire, uh, initially with Britain, and I think in a way today with America. I mean, a lot of our behaviour is about saying, we know you're bullying us, but we actually want to, we can see how America can be better than what you're doing now. Let us play a bigger role in defence. Let us play a bigger role in our relationship with China. Let us play a bigger role in bringing India into the fold. All these kind of sort of, deputy sort of roles, if you like, that Australia's performed within the international power network.
I think deputy is not a bad way of
Mm,
thinking about it, but I would like to run one more idea by you also as somebody who looks at like the development of the long term, which is like, this general way um in which we put ourselves not into boxes, but into units
mm,
in which we think the world runs. And if you look at it in a long time, in a long period, what we had since, at least if we take a Eurocentric framework,
mm,
since
mm,
1648 is the
mm.
Westphalian system, right?
Yeah.
With the idea that whoever controls the territory makes the rules. That was
Mm,
the big innovation of
mm,
1648, because before that you had a counter concept for the nation state, which was religion, right? Whoever makes the religious rules, then rules over the people who adhere to the same faith, whether they are here or there or over there. You have different rule books, right? And each one of the monotheistic faiths, the leaders of the faith, already like thousands of years ago, were always lawgivers, right? Moses brought his 10 plates.
mm,
Jesus said, no, 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 we have a new one. We have a new law, and the
mm,
Catholics, they made their book and so on, right? Later on, the Muhammad came and said, like, I have them directly from the hand of God, although it was my hand, but it was God who was writing. So here's the new rules. So the religions were always rule bringers. And then the idea was like, okay, the group of people, you behave according to these rules. 1648 comes along, or like the 30 Years' War and long development. And we said like, no, we're gonna organize nationally according to territory.
mm.
We had colonialism and expansion of these different nation states. And I just wonder, I mean, the rules-based international order, in a sense, is a new way of creating a community of people who are supposed to keep to one rule, even if the rule is not precisely
Mm.
written down, but it emanates from Washington and through its different emissaries, through its different institutions, including NATO. And these people, this group of people, they don't feel so much beholden to the nation state that they're
Mm.
de jure ruling over, than by this like very abstract idea of a value-based foreign policy, value-based, a group of
Mm.
countries. And in a sense, the demarcation then becomes the group of people who adhere to that and who in speech acts actually
Mm.
say like, yeah, 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 I'm with you. And the others are not. The Chinese are not. The Russians are not.
Mm.
They're breaking the rules, our rules. So we are the community. And in a sense, I wonder if we're seeing, a a evolution away from the 48 consensus, and in that sense also an evolution away from the United Nations, which is still built around that consensus. Did you ever conceptualize the current moment in a way as something that moves away from the nation state idea?
Well, I think yes, to some degree, because in a way, 45 is the birth of the world of nations. So before 45, I mean,
1945 or
yeah, 90.
1648?
Well, I mean, I've got just talking about 1945, at least initially. I mean, before 1945, you have territorial European empires.
The colonial empires, yeah.
Yeah, yeah, all the colonial empires. Japan is also pursuing its sort of nation empire as well. So, I mean, uh, 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 I question the narrative about the Treaty of Westphalia being the birth of the sort of nation system to some degree. I mean, because I feel it was one of many occasions through history where a kind of a sense of ordering of the world within the scope of those countries or those states was attempted. And it did do that in terms of sovereign equality and all that sort of thing. But the actual states were involved were, they were imperial monarchies. There was still the divided Germany. They were quite they it diminished the role of the Habsburg Empire, the huge Spanish Empire, but it also had some very different kind of states involved, and also clearly didn't reach far beyond Europe. Didn't even include Russia, as I understand the Treaty of Westphalia. So, but it was an attempt to order things, and it's really then nationalism really takes off more as a concept for nation more in the 19th century, partly through Napoleon, partly through cultural politics and language issues and all that sort of stuff in the 19th century, and then really gets fired up again in World War One with self-determination and Woodrow Wilson and the Treaty of Versailles and all that stuff. But that's also part of the decomposition of the Ottoman Empire, the decomposition of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and the transformation of the Soviet Union into a federation of kind of republic nations, if you like. So and then clearly there's this huge what the historian John Darwin, who I talk about quite a lot on my Substack and YouTube channel, has wrote this great book called After Tamerlan, The Rise and Fall of Global Empires from 1400 to 2000. And he really describes the period from 1910 to 1945, 42 as the crisis of the world, where a prior form of globalization sort of cracks, and then you have these various competing powers for power and influence, Britain, France, United States, Germany, Italy, and Japan, really crunching against each other. But they're also proposing a kind of an idea of a territorial nation empire. And then when that collapses in World War II, you get the United Nations, which is conceived as the world of equal nations that hasn't really been implemented before. But my sense of it is there's never really actually a genuine, clear consensus about the nature of that world of nations, that to some degree we've retrospectively read things back into our history, and especially after 1991, we've turned the nature of the extremely chaotic, turbulent post-1945 world into, the smooth sailing of Pax Americana and the liberal rules-based order. Whereas in fact, it's, almost immediately beset by, the Cold War, which is not just in Europe, but it's also involving China and East Asia. It's also immediately affected by decolonization, which, is opening up again the question of, well, what is a nation what is a nation in a country that is forming itself through decolonization out of a former empire? And in the case of India, for example, or British India, that happens extremely tragically in 1947 with the partition, which forms Pakistan and India. and millions of people, uh, there's or tens of millions of people are in these kind of refugee situations, migrations, and there's also a huge debate within the people seeking independence about what sort of nation should this be, or indeed what sort of supranational identity should this sort of nation have. So I do think the post 1945 world order has sort of buried um, uh, a lot of um, uncertainty about what it really means to act like a nation, to define a nation, to appeal to people, to feel that they belong to a nation rather than just being, a certain religious identity or certain communal identity or just not wanting to have all that much to do with their fellow citizens, and I feel that in a way that's almost coming back a little bit with the backlash of populism because people have a kind of transnational affiliations now. Like, we all watch Netflix or we all watch neutrality studies and we identify with the people from all sorts of different countries who are sort of seeking to develop ideas of a different model of international relations rather than just feel bounded, if you like, by the sort of prison of our national identity.
Okay, Jeff, then maybe let me continue by also asking you about this moment when we are witnessing mass violence, and we witness a lot of it, right? And we've had historians like Steve Pinker, who, especially in the 2010s, tended to point out that yes, we have violence, and yes, things are not perfect. We don't have world peace. We don't live on heaven on earth yet. But
Mm,
overall, if we take a bird's eye perspective, we actually are going through the most peaceful and most prosperous version of humanity ever. We've never been more. We've never been fed this well. And even though we have starvation in some parts of the planet, overall, we as a species are doing fantastic. Um, we are seeing serious doubts about this very optimistic assessment,
mm,
especially considering the fact that the dangers of annihilating that prosperity with the weapons that we created. And I know we both had people on our
mm,
channels who talked about the
mm,
dangers of these nuclear weapons and of this black swan event that we are able to bring about
mm,
ourselves in days past. People were afraid that the heaven might fall on their heads, or that judgment day will come because God decides for it to be
mm,
time. But now we are actually capable to initiate Armageddon ourselves, which is the one thing that worries me the most. And that
mm,
is not even talking about issues like climate change or other man-made problems, but just the bombs that we
mm,
created to kill ourselves. Um, and we are now again in a period where many people say, like, look, this is more dangerous than the Cuban Missile Crisis,
mm,
because in the missile crisis, at least Khrushchev and Kennedy understood that this needs to be de-escalated. And
mm,
Biden and Mr. Putin and now Trump and Putin and Xi, we don't know what the rationale is anymore, especially on the American side, whether
mm,
whether the consensus that a nuclear war is unwinnable and must never be fought is still as deeply ingrained in these leaders as we wish them to be. I think for the Russians, it's the case. The Chinese, I too believe that according to their nuclear doctrine, they do not want to fire first. The Americans actually don't have a no first shoot doctrine.
mm.
Russia, unfortunately, also like adjusted its doctrine recently. But um, what do you make out of the threat, the nuclear threat that is still like hanging above our heads?
Well, it's dreadful, isn't it? It wasn't, I think it was Einstein or something who said that, the next world war.
Will be the last. Yeah.
yeah, will be the last sort of thing, or the war after that will be fought with sticks and bones, something like that, and it is worrisome, and it's especially worrisome that there are various people with influential roles who seem to be able to, who want to countenance the use of limited sort of nuclear weapons. So, as I understand it, Elbridge Colby, the Deputy Defense Secretary in the United States, who's doing the big review of the defense strategy, not just for AUKUS, but also for the United States as a whole, has in the past, sort of advocated potential use of, you know, contained nuclear weapons in a conflict with China over Taiwan. And there was a really creepy paper out of one of the US think tanks where they kind of basically said, well, Taiwanese should just sort of suck it up, sort of thing, in pretty brutal sort of imperialist language. I might be misrepresenting them a little bit, but it is of concern. But there's also this other dynamic that seems to have emerged in recent times where we've seen the, Operation Spiderweb attack on the nuclear facilities of, so a kind of a sort of a asymmetrical, I guess, attack on nuclear capabilities, or a conventional attack on nuclear capabilities that has not immediately escalated. Some people say in Operation Sindoor between India and Pakistan, who are two nuclear armed states, that there was an attack on, I think it's the Karani Hills facility where Pakistan has its nuclear facilities. And the reports I've heard, and it may well be wrong because I'm not really a technical military person, but there were sort of attacks on the sort of the gates or the openings or the vents of the nuclear facility that actually disabled the capacity of Pakistan to use its nuclear weapons. So in a way, it's a similar kind of thing of a conventional weapon use that is actually neutering the effect of nuclear weapons. And I guess the third example is the Oreshnik missile that was used in Ukraine last year, I think, wasn't it? So again, it's a case of not a conventional weapon, but a non-nuclear weapon that is perceived to have the same sort of deterrent effect, if you like, but doesn't have the spillover effects, to put it in banal language, the nuclear fallout and all that sort of thing. So there seem to be a few examples of actual military conflicts between nuclear states involving the nuclear capabilities of those states that are as yet not provoking a more extreme attack, but it does seem to also be playing with fire. I think it's quite concerning. And in the India-Pakistan case, the leaders of India were explicitly saying that they've taken Pakistan's nuclear blackmail. I'm not saying this is correct. I'm just saying this is the view that they were expressing, that they'd taken Pakistan's nuclear blackmail card off the table by this attack. So, what if America decides, well, we're going to take Russia's nuclear blackmail target, out of action in some sort of way by such an attack. So I think it's very, very concerning.
The way this is new, the way that we see the willingness of adversaries to actually attack each other's nuclear facilities. And I mean, you absolutely correctly pointed out. I mean, we've seen 3, if not 4, such incidences this year, and the year still has like 5 more months left
Mm.
to go. The attack on the nuclear bombers with Russia, the spider web, and beyond like just the tactics used, but the fact that
Mm.
these planes were attacked,
Mm.
and then also all the stupid commentary online is like, oh, the Russians are
Mm.
so dumb, they leave them out in the open. Yeah, they have to
Yeah,
because there's a treaty
the
in order to
treaty.
control
Yeah.
that because we want exactly that kind of, mutual uh, uh, oversight of what's
Yeah.
actually happening because that creates stability. Such dumb comments, but again, people don't. Some people do this to provoke, and others just because they have no clue. But then the also the fact that we have this year two nuclear weapon states attacking a
Mm.
non-nuclear weapon state with
Mm.
Iran, right, and attacking its nuclear facilities. The which they even under the NPT are allowed to have and so
Mm.
on and guaranteed to have. And this idea again that the nuclear weapon states can and will, just treat non-nuclear weapon states however they want, including
Mm.
attacking them. And of course, on the other side, you have the same argument then made with what Russia is doing with Ukraine. The fact that Ukraine gave up nuclear weapons, although it must be said, uh, even if Ukraine had kept the nuclear weapon on its territories, they wouldn't have been able to use them. However,
Mm.
it would
Mm.
still have changed the rationale
Yeah.
if nuclear weapons were still stationed and kept under territory of Ukraine. So
Yeah.
we are seeing how
And
this logic is
Iran,
changing in front of our eyes.
yeah, Iran's another case to the bombing of the nuclear facility at Fidel. So it wasn't nuclear weapons, but it was a nuclear facility. And I
Yeah.
mean, if it had really been obliterated, God knows what that would have meant.
But Glenn Deason had a very important interview with Ted Postel
Mm.
last week, in which Ted Postel really convincingly made the case that now, after that attack, and now that these 400 kilograms of highly enriched uranium are untraceable, or we don't know where it is, we must consider Iran a nuclear weapon state, because he lays out beautifully how easy it is for the Iranians now to create a bomb,
Mm.
because the additional enrichment you need is minute. It can be done in a room the size of a medium apartment,
Mm.
and
Mm.
the technology to mount it on to deliver it is so rudimentary that it doesn't even need to be tested. He says, like,
Mm.
this is is an 80-year-old technology and so on. This anyone
Yeah.
can do this. Plus, even if they say they don't have it, the rationale would be, or the most logical thing to do is to deny having it while you actually develop it. So even if you believe them that they don't want to do it, it would still be safer to assume that they have them than not,
Yeah.
because otherwise you might be making a strategic mistake that is so dear that it would cost you everything if you were Israel, right? So we now are in a world where we need to assume that we have 10 nuclear weapon states, two of them undeclared, both of them in
Mm.
West Asia. So it's
And
escalating, isn't it?
it is, and I mean, this comes back to Australia too, because the criticism from, say, China and Russia of AUKUS and the nuclear submarine deal is that Australia is de facto breaching the nuclear proliferation treaty, that it's kind of equipping itself with nuclear capable weapons and giving, nice little promises that, it won't do anything. But it is sort of who can tell what they'll do in 10 to 20 years' time. And there, Australia's also agreed to sort of base this, America's nuclear submarine sort of fleet or its sort of nuclear capable sort of naval fleet. I'm not terribly good on all the technical stuff with the armies and stuff, but base it in as a city in Australia, in Perth, in the Indian Ocean. So, in a way, we're becoming a nuclear equipped forward base for America.
Yeah, which brings us back to
So
this
it's
idea of the extended empire, right? And
mm,
the arms or tentacles of the
yeah,
Western values
yeah,
community empire that
yeah,
apparently is struggling to hold on, and while doing so, tries to threaten everybody else, which worries people like us who think
Mm.
that we should clean up our own house before we tell others what
Yeah.
to do in theirs.
And like from my perspective, yeah, America has a global military presence that has never occurred before in world history, and is unique, really. And in a way, it actually has it enforced a partition in Europe, the Cold War. It enforced a partition in West Asia, Israel, Palestine. It enforced, I guess, in a way, a pretty messy partition in India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh. And then it also has a partition in the West Pacific and East Asia. So, Japan was militarily occupied. It was run as a military governorship for 8 years or so after World War II. Korea is still divided and has millions of troops who are actually, basically under the control of the US Armed Forces. And, Taiwan is, a complex issue, but in part, it's also a reflection of this kind of thing. And when people talk about American primacy in Asia, they often talk about it in abstract terms or sort of cultural, ideological, values-based terms, but it's also the defense of the continued military presence of the United States all through the West Pacific and West Asia, and now very much in Australasia. Like the former head of the Prime Minister's Department in Australia, John Menadue, describes Northern Australia now as a de facto American military colony because there's effectively a permanent base there and all that sort of thing. So in a way, it and both ideologically but also militarily, America is in a way digging itself in, entrenching itself to maintain that military presence. Why really do they still need to be there 80 years after World War II? Why really? And they have all sorts of ways to sort of, you know, uh, put sort of nicey language around it. But in the end, to use a sort of John Mearsheimer term, it boils down to this brutal reality.
Are we also living in a world where we imagine, sovereignty and the equality of nations and the Westphalian system, to be there, where in fact it's just a lovely little dream, right? We actually live in a world that works differently. And you have the mechanisms of that Nel Banilla describes. We have the empire imperial system, and if you talk to people like Radhika Desai, she will tell you why it is the ultimate fault of capitalist system that creates imperialism, right? If you use a Marxist analysis of international relations, so that in the end, we don't live really in nation states where the nation states make the rules. We live in much larger constructs, the the krakens that then work with their little arms, and unfortunately, we downstream are somewhere on the arms and not in the head. Do you think that any of this is going to change over the next couple of years, and whether this, maybe the last question, this view that we reviewed, like of Dimitri Trenin, that the Third World War has actually already started, and we are living now through the ups and downs of the hots and colds of that war, and we shouldn't think of the current period as a new Cold War. We should think of it as a third, global war. Does that conceptualization make sense to you?
Look, it does in many ways, and I've always been very hesitant to do that. And it's partly because I've been very influenced by another history of World War II by Richard Overy, who's a very distinguished British military historian, who it's called Blood and Ruins, the Great Imperial War, 1931 to 1945, which is, if we don't think of the Second World War as the Second World War, but as a different kind of event altogether that is also occurring over whatever that is, 15 years or so, from the sort of Japanese invasion into
Manchuria, yeah.
Manchuria through to and the Asian side of World War Two was a very large part of World War Two. Then we sort of, I mean, I feel there's a tendency to sort of treat the world wars as this kind of, a box office package of there's World War One and, America saved Europe, and then there's World War Two, and then America saved the world. And yeah, there might be World War Three, but America will save the world again, sort of thing. Uh, and so I feel that kind of thinking lulls people into a kind of thinking that it's going to be the same kind of war. And that's where I think Dimitri Trenon's concept is quite interesting, that it is a global conflict that is occurring in different modes and different ways, and may not ever quite go to the total organized, brutal violence that occurred in World War II, and that was enabled by, nationalist and racist ideologies, and also the continued existence of the empires and all that sort of stuff. But I do feel that there are so many global conflicts at the moment that it is something like that. But I almost wonder if it's also the start of the process of if you like, the decolonization, the American decolonization of the world, because the expansion of America since 1945 across the world is simply unprecedented. And it's simply, I mean, it just can't be sustained in any sort of practical way, or both in terms of leadership resources, economic resources, cultural resources, anything. There's just, too many other people in the world for America to control it all. So I feel it's almost like there's this long process of decolonization. I don't know what the right word is, sort of de-Americanization of the world that is actually underway. And, the Russia-Ukraine war is in part that. The sort of more greater assertiveness of Russia over the last 30 years is part of that. The greater assertiveness of China, since, I don't know, early 2000s, post the Deng Xiaoping era is also part of that. And so is, the multi-alignment of India. I mean, India is becoming a very, very, very significant player in the world. So I feel casting it in those terms is a little bit more optimistic, even though, who knows what could go wrong in that process. But I feel the reason I've always been wary about talking about it as World War III is you get stuck into this pattern of, well, it's going to play out in the same way. I actually think we're witnessing something that's actually quite unique, and we need to sort of see it as quite unique.
Yeah, but the problem with unique things is they don't give us the mental concept to grasp them properly. It's kind of sad when you think like, oh, in 20 years from now, we're going to understand this period much better. Yeah, great. Thank
you historians. You got historians do something.
So maybe but maybe we're also too much in a Western centric framework, where we think of war and peace as these two distinct moments. When in fact, even the Cold War is like clearly a blurred idea of that. But when we think of peace as a moment when then the laws of peace apply, and war the laws of war and so on, this is a very, very European way of actually, a 19th century way actually, in thinking of the distinction between the two. If we think of it maybe more as a moment when again we go back to the normal state of affairs, where unfortunately war warfare and mass violence are just part of the mix of the way the globe orders itself. Maybe we find in other places a better metaphors like, the Warring State period in China, where we define the entire period as one in which, okay, fine, there were just these principalities that were on and off in conflict with each other, and we could go to India and Kautilya and so on, which tell us about very similar moments for long stretches of time. We go to the Peloponnesian Wars, right, which was the one long history of on and off warfare between the Greeks, the Persians, and so on, the entire area.
Yeah,
Maybe
exactly.
those are the places to look for metaphors of what
Yeah,
proliferate.
yeah. And there's a book by Amitav Acharya called well, it's about this whole idea of the world order and the fact that there are many cultural traditions of statecraft that have tried to manage war and peace, world order in the sense of harmonious relationship, broadly peaceful relationships between different states. And I do think that's the hope that I have, at least, that we just tune into some of these other traditions and dial down the sort of story that especially comes out of those American political networks that Neil talks about. And find some ways of talking about it, like people like Dr. S. Jaishankar from the Indian External Affairs Minister. He's quite explicit about the fact that his thinking about foreign policy is informed by those sort of cultural traditions of statecraft and different sort of ways of viewing the world. So that's certainly where I sort of put my hope as my
Okay.
camera goes again.
And your camera is going black again. Jeff will take it as a cue that this is time. Everybody, if you want to check out Jeff's work, go to the Burning Archives on Substack on his YouTube channel. Both of them will be linked in the channel below. Jeff, get a new camera and we'll talk soon again.
Fantastic, Pascal. Thank you very much.